Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the lectures by Nobel laureates in economic sciences. Without further delay, may I first invite Professor Liu Pak-Wai to give a brief introduction of our next distinguished speaker, Professor Robert Mundell. Professor Liu, please.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my greatest pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Robert Mundell, 1999 Nobel laureate in economic sciences. Professor Mundell received his PhD from MIT in 1956. He taught at Stanford University and the University of Chicago for some years. Since 1974, he has been professor of economics, and since 2001, University Professor at Columbia University in New York. Professor Mundell has been advisor to a number of international agencies and organizations, including the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Commission, and several governments in Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Federal Reserve Board, the U.S. Treasury, and Government of Canada. And we may add also the Government of China. Professor Mundell's writings include over 100 articles in scientific journals and books. He has received over 50 honorary professorships and doctorates. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science and a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. He is known as the father of Euro, and he received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1999 for his analysis of monetary and fiscal policy under different exchange rate regimes and his analysis of optimum currency areas. Today, Professor Mundell will give a lecture on dollars, the RMB, and the world currency. Since China adopted a crawling peg to diffuse the pressure to revalue the RMB in 2006, the debate on China's exchange rate regime has continued unabated, and the U.S. currency continues to slide. The rise of the RMB and the fall of the U.S. dollar have widespread repercussions in the international financial markets. Today, Professor Mundell will enlighten us on the many interactions between the currencies and the international monetary system. So please join me to welcome Professor Robert Mundell, and may I invite him to ascend the stage to give us a lecture. Thank
you. Professor Liu, thank you very much for that introduction. Mr. Vice Chancellor, I'm very pleased to be back again to talk on this subject and related subjects. You'll probably notice in the script that the titles are a little different. The title on this was it now? Oh, yes, the China's RMB exchange rate and the international monetary system. When I was sort of getting this ready this morning, I didn't have the title in front of me, and I decided to use this innovative title, but you can see that they're actually quite close substitutes, so it won't be a different topic. I'll just touch on some things by way of introduction, megatrends in the world economy, and we'll see what they are as we go along. I'm going to start with this question of unprecedented global expansion. Right today, we're in 2007, most remarkable period in the world economy, where all the major economies in the world are hitting on four cylinders, as we used to say in the days of four-cylinder cars. The United States, the European economy, Japanese economy, the Chinese economy, the British economy, India, Brazil, Mexico, Russia, all those economies are in great shape. And that's never, I think, been before. And of course, we have to ask, how long is this going to last? But we should also think that the last 2 or 3 decades have been rather glorious periods, in a sense, in terms of at least American economic growth. From the 1982 until the present, there have been only 2 recessions. Of course, starting in 1982 was a recession year. But after that, we had a strong recovery, and then a global slowdown short recession in 1990, and then a glorious 10-year boom, and then a recession, small one, global slowdown in 2001, 2002, and now we're in the middle of this great expansion time. Of course, today interest rates went down by half a percentage point, signaling that the Federal Reserve at least is worried about the future, and this would be the way of keeping that global expansion going. And we'll have to see how successful that is. The strength of the major economies involves also lots of liquidity, strong expansion. At the Singapore meetings of the IMF, annual meetings of the IMF last year, the IMF, one of the big subjects was the IMF was in financial difficulties. Why? Because nobody wanted to borrow from it. And that's how the IMF survives, how it gets its finance, by the interest charges on borrowing. But all the emerging market countries, which were the typical great borrowers, were in great shape, and they had lots of liquidity. They had balance of payment surpluses. So that's not unconnected with the U.S. deficit. It's the deficits of the United States equal the surpluses of the rest of the world. So that's in good very important connection. And the problem for the IMF is it's like a hospital. When the people are healthy, the hospitals go broke. So we should always hope that the IMF is in financial difficulties. But the U.S. deficits feed the rest of the world with liquidity, because we've been in a dollar standard, a kind of dollar standard, one of the many dollar standards, really since the beginnings or the middle of World War I, back in 1915. Without those deficits, the world would be in a state of depression. Now, the second megatrend, globalization, came about as a result of the end of the Cold War, because globalization is the natural state for mankind. They want to trade and experience the gains from trade, and they will do that naturally unless certain things block them. When the world is blocked up into empires or into our enemies, trade barriers, or they're cut off, as under the Cold War period, then you don't have globalization. But once those barriers are taken down, with the end of the Cold War, this became the great expansion. Globalization today is not an option. It's an inescapable reality. There's no defense against it. The only issue is how we should manage it. Now, the next issue is the Silicon Valley IT revolution, which is also, like globalization, going to be with us for a long time, like the printing press and the electricity revolution combined. It greatly cheapens an expensive factor of production, knowledge and technology. It increases productivity and lowers costs in all sectors of economic life, in firms, households, banks, and governments. Productivity growth will be with us from the information technology for the rest of the century and beyond, even if there are no new inventions, because just the mere spread of this phenomenon is going to penetrate deeply and spread more broadly over all countries. And of course, we're going to have great innovations. Moore's law hasn't been broken yet, this law that tells how rapidly computer processes go on, keep expanding. Next thing is the advent of the euro, a mega trend, most important change in the international monetary system since the creation of the Federal Reserve Board system in 1913. That may seem a little bit idiosyncratic to single out those two events. The most important event, the creation of the Federal Reserve. The second most important event, the creation of the European monetary system. It's because we're accustomed to thinking of the gold standard, the breakdown of the gold standard in World War I, the recreation of it in the 1920s, the breakdown in the 1930s, the stock market crash, the Great Depression, the devaluation of the dollar, the International Monetary Fund, and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. All those could be thought of as important monetary events, but nothing like the creation of the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, because this changed the power configuration of the system. When there's a unity in the whole 20th century that's based around the way in which the dollar standard evolved relative to gold, the way the dollar edged out gold from the system and took over its role as the principal currency system. But the euro becomes important because it creates an alternative to the dollar and a bipolar currency world. 1999, euro became number 2 in the world, pushing the yen to the 3rd place. Now this makes a challenge to the dollar. The dollar euro exchange rate ranks with the dollar price of oil as the most important price in the world. Now, you know, yesterday was a landmark day too, with the change reduction in the Fed. The price of oil went up to $82, a major effect. This is, looking at the euro, this is the situation of the world before the euro came to being, let's say around 1990. These globes represent monetary areas, more or less proportionate to GDP of the country. And the biggest is the dollar area, and then at that time, 1990, the yen was enormous because the exchange rate of the yen had soared, and everybody was predicting the yen was going to take over from the dollar. Every one of the top 10 banks in the world were Japanese in 1990. And now, great exaggeration, but this is why the yen looks, the black up on the left there looks so strong. And then the Balkanized European currency areas and so on. But look at the way things happened after the euro. After the euro, you got that consolidation of the European currencies. And a big power, a new monetary power came in that was more important, and that created the reason why the dollar-euro relationship is going to be one that continues. So the euro activated the monetary power of the countries of the European monetary system, just as the creation of the Fed activated the monetary power of the United States. The euro represents a challenge to the dollar. Other countries are trying to hold more euros, will exert a trend toward an overvalued euro, because just in terms of the currency composition of the global economy, there's going to be a nagging demand for euros to add into the portfolios of central banks. And then it puts the smaller currencies around it at a disadvantage. We think it's a great thing, it's a wonderful thing for Europe, and maybe it's good for the world economy. But don't think if you're one of those little Balkanized countries in North Africa, if you're in Algeria, or Morocco, or Libya, or Egypt, or Sweden, or those big areas, put those others into the shade. And even the pound sterling is dislodged by this. The euro was not good news for the pound, for the British. It was not good news. If Britain had come in, it would have been great for the euro and probably great for the British, because they'd have part of this great new empire. If you look at Europe from the southern Mediterranean, you see this enormous territory, this GDP of $14 trillion just north of them, and the way in which that is going to affect and dominate their lives. Now we come to China. The rise of China, the most important fact of the early 21st century. Just like 100 years ago, the rise of the United States was the most important fact of modern history. There was a book written on it by the American ambassador to London. He gave a speech at Cambridge University. He said the book was called The Greatest Fact of Modern History, and it was the rise of the United States, because suddenly you had a country which had started 200 years ago, 1790s, 4 million people, had suddenly become a country of 90 million, 100 million and more, and was destined by the time of World War I to be bigger than the next 3 biggest economies put together. So that made a sea change in it, the rise of the United States then. Now China is coming forward. I think if you're comparing which is the greatest impact in terms of those 2 centuries, I think the rise of the United States is still greater and more special than China's is. Of course, remember, China's been around a long time, thousands of years. The United States is Johnny-come-lately in the world economy, but to come from a nation of 4 million people to the superpower that's become is something rather special. The rise of China, though, can change global governance, like the rise of the euro in the international monetary system. You know, the problems of the world have, the wartime problems of the world have nearly always come about as a result of a new rising power upsetting the status quo, and the status quo resistance to that monetary power. That was true when Germany was thrusting ahead and created the World War I in Great Britain, and it was true to an extent in World War II with Japan and so on. So this is going to be, the management of this is going to be something that has to be addressed. China's growth is spectacular and for a period durable, but major headaches of pollution, environmental degradation, and China's contribution to global warming, as Professor Schelling has pointed out very well, have to be considered. Global imbalances. The dollar has been the dominant currency since 1915, the year after World War I began. 1914, capital rushed to London because London was still a safe haven, and the pound rose up above its gold points by a huge amount because you couldn't ship gold to London fast enough. But as soon as people realized that this was not going to be a war of a few weeks, World War I was going to be a long war, then they realized that Britain would be in much weaker position, and the power shifted to the United States. And the U.S. shifted from being a debtor country to a creditor country, as the European countries had to sell off their assets in the United States to pay for the war. So ever since then, from 1915 until 1970, the U.S. ran trade surpluses, big, persistent, chronic trade surpluses. You may find one year in that long period when there was not a trade surplus of the United States, from 1915 to 1975, let's say. But then after 1975, deficits started, and they got bigger and bigger. Was it come about because the United States is weak? No, it came about because the international monetary system broke up. There was a system of fixed exchange rates, and what that system did in the post-war period from 1945 to 1971, what that did was to equalize the power of currencies. A fixed exchange rate system neutralizes the weakness of small currencies. As long as it's like an alliance. If you're part of an alliance, you're a tiny country in an alliance, and you're independent, you're lost, or you're very weak anyway. But if you're part of a big alliance, then you're just individuals in that are just as strong as anywhere else. This is the important thing. But when the world moved to flexible exchange rates, because gold had become underpriced and nobody wanted to, the United States didn't want to raise the price again to compensate for the inflation, all the individual countries went their own way, and then they're individually lost. But just imagine this world of the IMF has 185 countries. Imagine this world with tiny little countries of 10,000 people, each with a separate currency and floating against one another. These currencies are of no use whatsoever in the international scale. There's only a few currencies of the world that can ever be used internationally. And but if a country, the Hong Kong dollar is an important currency because it's always convertible into the US dollar. And the Panamanian Balboa is just as good as the dollar because it's been that way since Panama started. The fixed exchange rate is a way of neutralizing the power differentials between the countries. Now, dollar imbalances can't be explained by policies of Japan, China, or the oil countries because they're endemic in the system. Imbalances can't be solved by bashing. That was tried in the 1970s. Japan, after the Plaza Accord in 1985, the Japanese currency soared, it tripled in value against the US dollar in the next 10 years. It ruined the Japanese economy, but it didn't change the surpluses. Japan, from the 1980 until the present, every year has had $100 to $150 billion surplus. It has nothing to do with exchange rates. So don't fall into the trap, the sophomore or freshman error of thinking that exchange rates determine trade balances. What would you do in the world of a common currency? You'd still have trade balances, but there'd be no exchange rates. So there's a dollar cycle. The dollar cycle is reflected in imbalances under fixed exchange rates, and it's reflected in fluctuations in the currency under flexible rates. If you look at it, you can see the path of the dollar. This is since 1970 up to more or less the present. And you see the cycle of the dollar against the European currencies. We can call it the euro because the facsimile of the euro was the European currency unit, the ECU, before the euro came into being. The weighted average of the European currencies, the basket, European basket. So the basket was soared when the dollar was weak in the 1970s, and the U.S. had 13% inflation, terrible period for the United States. And then the Reaganomics, under Reaganomics, you had a combination of tax cuts, change in the policy mix, and tight money that brought the economy back toward growth. It stopped the inflation, and you had a soaring dollar that helped in it. And then, though, after 1985, the Plaza Accord, in the middle there, after 1985, when the euro went back up again, because the U.S. wanted the dollar to go down to keep the growth boom going, and it was successful in this. And then you had the the creation of the unification of Germany, which had a big shock to the European system, and then that was in 1990. And then in the last half of the last century, the euro fell way down when the dollar was soaring. And then that soaring dollar continued until the 2002, which was the global slowdown, and then the dollar weakened again, and the European was went up. Well, dollar, whatever happens, over those cycles, over those changes, what emerges, and what has emerged all through the 20th century, there's crises that come, crises of the dollar, and whenever there are, the system changes. And then you work through another version of the dollar cycle. So you go through different $5 standards. I don't have time to go into them now, but there are 5 very pronounced periods of a dollar standard, and who knows what's going to happen. Right now, the newest dollar standard came about as a result of the bipolar system created by the euro, and this will last for, well, we'll see what will be the big change. The deficits, big deficits since 1990, but also in the 1980s there were big U.S. deficits, current account deficits, $800 and some billion now, expected to continue over. They're not going to get smaller. They're not going to get smaller, and the public loves them. The rest of the world loves them because they love surpluses. So the counterparts of those surpluses, though, of the U.S. deficit, has to be the surpluses of the rest of the world. But by looking at all the fanfare about it, you'd think that China is the biggest culprit in this. Not so. Actually, Japan and China have been had counterparts in surpluses, and they have surpluses out. But the biggest culprits are the oil exporting countries. When the price of oil goes up, the balance of payments of those increase. So if you've got $850 billion of deficits, you've got $500 billion of surpluses of the oil exporting countries. And then China's surplus is now about $200 billion, $225 billion, and Japan's is about 175, and those are the things. But the basic part of the surplus is not that. Real exchange rate changes, relates the current account balance with the United States, but you don't, with the real exchange rate over that period, but you don't get any correlation between those two. U.S. supplies liquidity to the rest of the world. Dollar reserves are now $5 trillion, more than $5 trillion. 1/4 of them is held by China. And make no mistake about it, the last 5 years, a tremendous buildup of $1 trillion in foreign exchange out of all proportion to what any other country has done. But what it's done for China is to push China into the forefront in the global economy. So that China now becomes a global player in the system. You can ask, is a dollar crisis coming? Probably. There's been several in the past. There'll be several again. And when it does, the system will change. And we have to see how it will change. But when the dollar gets weak, the U.S. indebtedness goes down. The U.S. right now has about $10 trillion of assets abroad, and it's got liabilities of about $13 trillion. So it's about maybe $3,500 billion of net indebtedness abroad. That's not a large amount for a country with a capital stock of about $60 trillion. So it's not a large part. But there will come a problem, and then the system will move itself around, and you'll get to that again. Now, China's exchange rate policy. Between 1997 and today, China has had, on the average, a better record on inflation than any of the G7 countries. Inflation has been China's early policies before in the 1980s and early 1990s were inflationary, but they're not inflationary now, and they're not deflationary. They've been better on average. China has got most of that period was a fixed exchange rate period, when the dollar was fixed at 8.28 RMB, and that was for July 1997 until July 2005. And that fixed exchange rate gave China a better record on inflation than any of the G7 countries which were using inflation targeting. That's something to reflect on. Over the period now, stabilizing the dollar has been stable in terms of commodities, with an average inflation rate of 3% or less. The dollar area represents 30% of the world economy, whereas the RMB area, the production of China in the world economy, China's GDP over global GDP, is only 5%. So stabilizing the RMB in terms of the dollar gives China approximate price stability in terms of 35% of the world economy. This is good. It means the RMB has stability over 35% of the world economy instead of 5%. That's a good goal, a good target for getting monetary stability. If the example of a country doing inflation targeting in an area is the euro. The euro has done inflation targeting, and it's had a 2% average inflation rate over the whole period. So since the euro began, and that's commendable, maybe, but it's been at the expense of huge swings in the dollar-euro exchange rate. It went from the euro started at $1.18, then it fell to 82 cents. That's a 40% drop, and then it rose to $1.37. That's a 70% increase in the euro. Just imagine if the RMB dollar rate, if the Chinese central bank went on to inflation targeting following a policy like this, and the RMB dollar exchange rate fluctuated by going down to 5 and then up to 10 and then back to 5 again like that. What devastating effects that would have, given the fact that China is still not a great size in the global picture compared to the dollar. What you'd get is that you'd have dollarization. You wouldn't price real estate in RMB anymore because it's unstable in terms of dollars. You'd have dollarization in China just as you have dollarization in every Latin American country and many African countries. They price hard things like real estate and such things in dollars, even if they then do the transactions in the local currency, looking at multiplied by the exchange rate. So the RMB would lose its moneyness, and it would also lose its expanding influence in Southeast Asia. So the flaws of inflation targeting, my time is getting too light to go on with this, but great gain from aligning prices with the United States. Many people don't realize this. They don't think about this. But China, the United States has a history of relative prices that reflect as well as any economy in the world and better than any other economy, the relative costs in the world economy. And by fixing the exchange rate, China acquires those relative prices. So this is a tremendous advantage for the efficiency of the allocation of resources, investment, etc. Whereas if China was doing inflation targeting and the dollar-euro, the dollar-RMB rate were going way up and down, you'd have shifts back and forth between the price of domestic goods and tradable goods. And it would go up and down, and there'd be tremendous confusion in the system. So, leave that one aside. Foreign exchange reserves, I've said they're very high. The sterilization is not a good policy because you simply have to, if you fix to a currency like Hong Kong does, Hong Kong fixes to the dollar. It's done that with some minor exceptions since 1983. That becomes the monetary policy. Don't have any other monetary policy than that, and you'll end up with that kind of result. Hong Kong gets a very good result in price stability. China had deflation in the Now, recognize it's not perfect. Fixing to the dollar means that when the dollar gets strong, as it did in the late 1990s, there's going to be a little bit of deflation. And China had it. Every country that fixed to the dollar had that. And when the dollar gets weak, there's going to be a little bit of inflation. There was a blip in the inflation rate in China. It went up to a maximum point of about 5.8% in August 2004, August. And then at that time, the IMF was jumping on this and saying, China has to appreciate its currency or float in its own interest. But it didn't do it, and the inflation rate came down by the spring of 2005 to 2%. So there was no reason at that point to panic and to change the exchange rate policy. Well, that's the basic message I have. I was, in my basic policy is that what China should do, it's moved from 8.28 to the dollar down to 7.5, almost 7.5. Instead of letting it go down, I think it should stop at that very convenient number where $4 equals 30 RMB at 7.5 and keep that for the foreseeable future. Keep that for a while and study the effects that have already occurred of that almost 10% appreciation of the currency. See what effect that has had, and let the IMF study the effects of it and see. But I think the basic policy should be that you stop that, because in the long run, you'll get into the difficulties that Japan got if the currency starts to over-appreciate and you get deflation and other things like that. So, well, now I just want to as I go on, I'm talking here about for the world economy, we need a global currency. We don't want the dollar. I'm saying, yes, the dollar is still the world currency, the international currency, but in the long run, it's going to not work. Even if we had all these dollar crises, eventually you'll have to have some kind of new composite currency that becomes the global currency. That's the way. It's a little bit like languages. You need a common currency for this. So that's what the path to it. I'll just close on this. Need to build world currency around, or use key currencies. Key currencies are the dollar, euro, yen. Right now, the British pound and Chinese yuan are alternatives or supplements. Take a basket of those and build the basis for a world currency around that. Closer monetary integration, even monetary union would be a step in that direction. Of course, you could flirt with the idea of an Asian currency, like Europe did. But Europe was able to go for that Asian currency because there was a complete healing, I guess complete, of the Franco-German conflict that had been a problem in Europe for 2 centuries. So that problem was solved. And the problem politically in Asia, to get an all-Asian currency, you need to have a good agreement between Japan and China. In the meantime, until that comes about, I think the RMB will continue to expand as a regional currency in Asia and certainly among the ASEAN countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mundell, for sharing your insights with us. Professor Mundell has agreed to take a few questions from the floor. Audience may use the microphones in the middle of the hall. May I now invite Professor Liu Pak-Wai to moderate the question and answer session. Professor Liu, please.
Well, thank you, Professor Mundell, for the very exciting lecture on the rise and fall of the renminbi and the dollar, and also for the need for global currency. We have only time to entertain 2 questions, so take your opportunity.
Professor Mundell, Jonathan Batten, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. A question that has often been advanced in this region concerns the use of the currency reserves being built up by the major the currency reserves, the build-up of foreign currency reserves in this region. Now, there have been proposals put forward for an Asian bond fund, which you probably are familiar with. Do you have any thoughts or would like to offer any opinions on the development of a regional bond market? Thank you.
Well, to have an Asian bond market, the main barrier to it is a common currency to be used in it. Europe got a European bond market among the Euro countries because they have a common denominator. You got a continental-wide capital market in Europe. Never had it before the 1999, except insofar it was a euro-dollar market. Europe was united, in a sense, under the dollar because people used the dollar as the natural instrument. And then they got the euro, and now there's a European bond market. But if you have a bond market in Asia, to an extent, there's always a bond market. The question is how much of a common bond market. You have a bond market in every currency. But if you could have what would normally rise, and you may know more about this than I do, you would have bonds denominated now in one of the top currencies. They were typically in dollars or in yen, or maybe in pounds, but probably less likely. Or, of course, in China, could be in RMB, but remember the Chinese currency is not convertible. So that creates a problem. And although there are differences of opinions on this, I don't believe the Chinese currency will in fact become convertible in any near time. So I think if you had a common, you could have a basket of currencies, like an Asian currency unit basket, the way Europe had, but it was never so successful in Europe, that the European currency unit basket, because people didn't know what it was going to be worth, and it not much of an advantage of that over using dollars or yen.
All right, the second last question will be reserved for a student upstairs. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Mundell. I'm Suron, a psychology undergrad at the Chinese U of Hong Kong. You have mentioned in your presentation the benefits of linking the renminbi to US dollar, but now currently the Chinese government is pegging the renminbi with a basket of foreign currencies like euro and US dollars and other currencies. So do you think it's more beneficial for the for China to peg renminbi only to dollar versus to a basket of different currencies? And what are the pros and cons of these two different currency policies? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the period from the time of floating until the present, and you make a chart on it, you'll see a chart of the RMB against the dollar and against the euro and against the yen. But you see a line of progression that looks pretty straight in the appreciation against the dollar and fluctuations in the other two currencies. And that indicates to me that by whatever the basket is, it's principally the dollar. You can have a basket of 12 currencies or 100 currencies, but if the dollar has 75% weight in them and the other currencies have a small amount, it's still going to reflect that. So when a country says it's going to have a basket of 1 or a basket of 10 or a basket of 20, it doesn't matter unless they state precisely what the basket is and whether the basket is fixed. Most countries that use baskets do it in order to camouflage and so they can have the option of changing the weighting system in the basket. What people do is they run correlations and they try to find out what the basket is. But I don't believe that I believe that essentially the target for the RMB is going to stay for some time to come the US dollar. And if it started to move toward the euro, I think it's going to get into the problem then of shifting away from that nice relationship of the scarcity relationships of the United States into that of a much less clear system of the European system.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you have other questions you want to raise, but in the interest of time, you can bring them up after the lectures. May I invite you to give a round of applause to Professor Mandel.
Thank you very much.